Where do the children or adults, or where do they sleep?
When they're staying in shelter or
Yeah.
when they don't? Yep. So there are different shelters in the Twin Cities that are for young people, usually depending on the shelter, sometimes up through the age of 17, or we have a shelter called the Safe House.
Okay.
That's ages 16 through 20. And so, for example, there at that shelter, it's a house. It looks just like any house in your neighborhood. And so there's different bedrooms, and there's 6 young people can stay there at a time. So sometimes, just depends on the combination of people. Sometimes you're in your own room, sometimes you're sharing a room with someone else. But just kind of like your house where you would be sharing a room with someone. That's what the Safe House is like. Other shelters look a little bit different and might feel a little bit more like a dorm room where you have your own sleeping space or a shared sleeping space, and then a common area that people use together.
Okay. In the shelter, how many beds do you usually have?
Well, the Safe House, for example,
Okay.
we have 10 physical beds. Okay, so like there are 10
Yep.
beds there, but only 6 people can stay there at a time.
Uh-huh.
And that we have to follow some rules with licensing or in our neighborhood. So it would be a different license. You have to be licensed to be a shelter. It would be different if we had more people. And that requires the support of the neighborhood and things like that to sort of have more people stay there.
How many people do you usually get?
We are generally, at the Safe House, we're generally full every night. And we turn away maybe 8 to 10 calls a night of people who want to access the shelter, but there's no room.
What do you do with the people that can't get a bed? Do you turn them back to the streets, or do you find them a shelter? Or?
Usually what we do is give them information for other shelters in case they don't have that information already. So, okay, try another shelter for young people. We really like folks to be in spaces that are specifically for youth, because there's supports that are really specific to that. And it can be really scary to be in a shelter that's for adults, 18 and over. Those are a little bit rougher places to be. So we like them to be in supportive shelter spaces. But unfortunately, in the Twin Cities, there's less than 100 beds, like spaces on a given night for young people in youth shelters, and there are many, many, many more folks than that who need a place to stay.
Okay.
And so that does mean that if there's not a place to stay at our shelter, and we say here's other places to try, then that may mean that a young person doesn't necessarily have a place to go. Sometimes that means they'll find a place with a friend for a night.
Okay.
Maybe you end up riding the bus for the night or trying to be someplace safe. And we can also refer people to outreach workers who can help think through that. How can you be safe tonight if you don't have a place to stay in a shelter? But unfortunately, it also makes folks pretty vulnerable, because when you don't have a place to stay and you're feeling desperate, it's really easy to be taken advantage of. You know, someone who might let you stay at their place but expect something in return. So, that's unfortunately the situation, that there are more people who need a space than there are shelters that can house them.
And I've also heard there are some people with like disabilities that they can't function in a shelter.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your solutions, or how do you help them?
That's a very good question. I think generally there's sort of lots of different kinds of services.
Yep.
And I think that usually, or often in that case, folks end up sort of getting connected to other types of housing through disability type services, just depending on what that is. disability is. We certainly
Like, I've seen